15.
I really don't like doing this, so I'm very nervous. So number one, you're going to have to forgive me. Number two, you're going to have to forgive me for another thing. I do tend to have Tourette's when I'm nervous, and I end up swearing quite a lot. So it's that's my inner little Hampton, I have to say. I suppose what I'm passionate about, I have actually written something, and I am dyslexic, so I'm going to read it. So that's another kind of point in the wrong direction. However, I am passionate about sex, and I think this has come from, I'm not quite sure where it's come from, quite frankly, other than my Italian grandmother who had an illicit affair that gave birth to my mother, who was also very filthy. So I think it's kind of in my blood. But within it, I am a feminist. I was born into a father who was a feminist and a mother that was a feminist. And I suppose being a feminist, sex is contentious, and it makes you want to explore the subject quite vehemently. So the thing is about sex that I was really passionate about. I think I tricked myself when I opened up Coco de Mer 10 years ago. I tricked myself into thinking one thing, and it ended up being another thing. I opened up Coco de Mer, which is a very, has anybody been to Coco de Mer? That section of everybody filthy to the left. Coco de Mer is a very luxurious, beautiful, ethical sex shop. And I opened it up 10 years ago. And I actually sold my company in December. So I've had a decade of decadence and debauchery. But really, during that time, I have to say that I went into Coco de Mer because I wanted to transform the way we as a society related to sex. I wanted to, I'm an activist. And through my activism, I wanted to inject, I was working at the time as an activist, really dealing with the issues around prostitution and the abuses around prostitution and selling of sex. And then I realized it was very dark and it was bringing me down. And I wanted to then create something more of a social aspiration. What is our ideal about sex within our society? And I thought, fuck it, I'm going to create it because I couldn't find it. So, and I also, that brought me to my own kind of sexual kind of questions as a young woman. And I think the thing is I have to say, after 10 years of working on a shop floor, having people come to me with their sexual problems, I have to say I feel grateful. I feel really grateful to Coco de Mer. I feel like it's an entity outside of me. And I feel ultimately grateful to all of my customers, because the truth is I'm uneducated, dyslexic, never went to university. Coco de Mer has been my university, and I've learnt an inordinate amount, not only an inordinate amount of information, but actually I have to say through my business I've changed and I've transformed, and I actually feel like I'm a better person and, luckily, a better lover, else I would be fucked. Okay. My teachers, my customers ultimately were my best teachers. And I have to say, I don't believe in sexperts. I really don't. I don't think there is such a thing as a sexpert, because let's face it, we all actually do have sex. And while I have paid myself to think about sex all day, I can say hands down that you all have, well, not all of you, some of you, hopefully some of you, most of you, I'm sure, or maybe some of you have had more sex than I have. And definitely there is a section, maybe a few, maybe not more, who've had more adventurous sex or have done things I've never done, which I am still waiting to do. So the thing is that the reality is when I opened up Coco de Mer, my attitude towards sex is vastly different from what it is now. I opened up Coco de Mer, as I said, to change the way we as a society approach sex. I wanted to inject into the commercial element of sex, or the sex industry, I wanted to inject beauty, intimacy. I wanted to actually inject the word love into the world of sex. And I really wanted to actually, ultimately, for it to be built on the foundation of respect. And really the only issue or the only thing around sexual liberation that really makes sexual liberation a feasibility is the word consent. And within that, it is a playground. And so I think that I went into Coco de Mer quite intellectually. And I have to say, the way I have changed was when I opened it, I was 30, now I'm 40. I had a 2-year-old and now I have a teenager. I was married and now I'm divorced. So I'm not quite sure like where my growth has come from. But I have, as I said, been thinking about it a lot. And I think in the sense that while I opened it up as an activist statement or a creative proposition, what it ended up has been is a personal journey, and it has been the nuttiest self-development course I could have ever asked for. But the thing is my shop floor is a hugely public place. I don't own it anymore, but it was a hugely public place. That there was no privacy on my shop floor, and people flew all around the world to speak to me and to basically ask questions. And the thing is what I ended up having was a huge global cross-cultural kind of access to secrets that not many people talk about. And these secrets actually did transform me. And I think the thing is I tried to help people the best I could, but in the truth, my customers actually ended up helping me, because as life is a great mirror, right? You set yourself up on a platform and then you realize you know fuck all. But through your customers, I learned absolutely a lot. And I say 90% of my customers, all who had sexual questions, they would never seek professional help. They would never go to a doctor, and they didn't talk to their partners. They definitely didn't ask their parents for advice, and they had absolutely nowhere to go to get honest information. And it was like a melody of madness where we just basically was a place where we could discuss. And sometimes you'd look around and think, what the hell am I talking about with every complete strangers that I didn't know anything, you know? And I think in that way, I really, I realized that through their quest to get an honest answer, I ended up asking myself some kind of honest questions. And it's through those mirrors that really that's where self-development kind of happens. I think the first time I realized that actually I wasn't making a social cultural statement, but actually this was going to have much more of a profound effect on me, was before I opened up my shop, and I had decided that I wanted Covent Garden to be the home of Coco de Mer. Covent Garden being the original erogenous zone of London, where Casanova got rebuffed by the famous courtesan Kitty Fisher, and where, like, you know, Hogarth kind of penned all kinds of like debauchery visions, and the Covent Garden ladies. And of course, the first sex shop in London was owned by a woman in the 18th century who sold condoms and velvet pouches, and she had vases of nettles and brambles, which I think was quite fantastic. It's like a kind of sexual flower shop of like a very unfriendly nature. So I kind of went to this, wanted to find out about Coco de Mer in its first home, and I found this historian who was 80 years old. And I'm going to talk about age here because it really did transform me, this. And it was a woman, and she lived right by the British Museum. And I thought, okay, I'm opening up Coco de Mer in Monmouth Street, the heart of Covent Garden. I want to know. So I knocked, I found her, she invited me into her home. And as soon as I walked through the door, I was completely bowled over because she was completely disinterested in talking about history with me. She wanted to talk to me about her sex life. I was 30, never talked to a woman in their 80s before about their sex life, and suddenly I was kind of, you know, put into a state of shock and silence, and she started telling me her story, and her story was quite simple. She had a normal sex life until she was 70. She had a husband of 40 years. And then suddenly, one day in her early 70s, she woke up and she was horny like a teenager. And I was like, holy fuck. And then suddenly she was like, well, what do I do with this? And she was like, okay. And then suddenly her husband died 3 years later, and she was left with this sex drive that she was very unacquainted with, and she felt like she was a fish out of water. She was 80 years old. Oh, no, she was in her mid-70s. She had a very strong sexual appetite, and by the luck of nature, she met a 40-year-old, right, who then became her lover, who was a gynecologist. And then, so within this situation, I'm sitting there and she's telling me about her gynecologist lover, her increased sexual appetite. And then she said, but honey, I'm quite sensual and tactile and romantic, and he's quite clinical. And the way that he kind of has sex with me, I'm kind of feel quite confronted by, but I'm not quite sure whether or not I should let go of this relationship. And I had 2 epiphanies. Number one, that actually my sex life at 30 wasn't going to go on a decrease. And number 2, the shit doesn't change. She sounded just like one of my friends who I was talking to the other night. So there was a kind of a duality to this kind of epiphany, one that is really that we have a sexual relationship with ourselves forever. It never dies, it never goes. The second thing is really at the same time that actually, and this is something I've learned from speaking to teenagers, to people of all ages, backgrounds, ethnicity, we all have the same issues. All have the same issues. And I find that quite kind of, I don't know, I kind of find it inspiring in a way that life and sex, there is no mystery to it. I think the thing is what I then learned was actually there's an inhibitory part of our brain that dissolves the older that we get, that controls our social behavior. With women, we are sexually controlled by society, because actually if we show our true appetite, we are shunned and scorned. So the older that we get and the more it dissolves, the stronger our desires to have sex becomes. So there is a lot of 70-year-olds wanting to have sex at quite an increased rate. The reality is socially, we are sexually repressed, right? We don't allow people of age to be sexually depicted as powerful creatures. We don't allow ugly people to be perceived as sexually powerful creatures. And we definitely don't allow disabled people to have a sexual identity. And this sexual repression is a lie. Because actually all we allow is young, beautiful, heterosexual people to be depicted to have a powerful, embraced sexuality. And this lie creates a social dysfunction, because sex isn't about what the people look like when we fuck them. It is more about the nature of the person that we make love to that makes something fulfilling. And I know this is like not really rocket science, but really there is 2 issues for me, which is who are we as individuals, but who are we collectively, socially, within our sexual identity? And the truth is that we've disallowed our sexual holistic character to exist. Does that make sense? Right, okay. I'm not following this, it's really dodgy. Okay, here we go. Gone past that a little bit. Sorry. Okay, but definitely gone past that bit. So this gets me to, I suppose, at Coco de Mer, I gave a lot of lessons on how to, because that's what people want to hear. Right? They want to know how to give a great blowjob, or how to do bondage for the first time, or how to spank, or the importance of spanking. And I suppose that's why they come to me, because I can show them. But the point is within all of this is just mechanics. Mechanics are a vehicle The truth around what sex really is to us on an individual basis is it is in its most transformative state. The true issue that we ignore socially is the role of pleasure within our life. Pleasure is emotive. Pleasure is incorporative of the whole of who we are, and it's almost inexplicable. You can't really truly explain the origins of pleasure, what sparks that first ignition of what pleasure can kind of create. And I think we have mistaken sex to something that's outside of us on a physical basis. We have mistaken sex for something that is a function, something that we do, but not something that we occupy, not something that expresses the whole of who we are. And that's where it's going so incredibly wrong, because out of it, our understanding of what sex is we've over-commodified it. We put too much value into it, and we've forgotten that actually sex is us. Does that make sense? And so the point is people think they section things off into the notion of sexual talent. Am I good at this? Am I good at in bed? I'm really great at blowjobs. I'm not very good at head. I'm it can be commodified, whereas actually in terms of advertising, sex sells everything. But the truth is that actually within society, we've disassociated ourselves from our sexual identity. That really sex incorporates our emotional self, our intellectual self, our physical self, our animalistic self, but also our spiritual self. And I think for me, what we need to do in order to be able to have a much more holistic and healing perspective around sex, we need to incorporate the whole character of who we are. And ultimately, the element that we really need to bring into, the element that is completely denied, is our spiritual sexual identity. Because all the great spiritual leaders of our world have denied sex. Jesus didn't really have it. Buddha definitely wasn't up for it. So we could go on to the Virgin fucking Mary really had a baby without it. So the point is what we really need to do is to realize that sex is an element that we have to really kind of look from in a much more a gentler eye, that's not necessarily, shouldn't be so fractious within our society. It shouldn't be so taboo driven. It shouldn't be so formulaic. It should be a lot more kind of, how do I say, honest. There you go. That's it.